So this is a basic definition to start with that I think is pretty universal. Hydrocolloids are any of several substances that yield gels with water, such as alginic acid salts, agar, as I alluded to before. The term might sound a little weird, might sound a little disenchanting, especially when it comes to your food. But rest assured, you have plenty of hydrocolloids that you guys are really familiar with. Gelatin, tapioca, flour, and cornstarch are, in fact, all forms of hydrocolloids. So you can see that you have actually been eating hydrocolloids your whole life, maybe knowing it or maybe not knowing it. Hydrocolloids are very much a part of the modern chef's pantry. If you were to look at my Adara pantry, you would see paprika, curry powder, cumin, tapioca maltodextrin, pectin. The use of hydrocolloids in our kind of cuisine has to be a bit more exact, a bit more purposeful and deliberate, and that's why we always use a gram scale. Okay, another function of hydrocolloids is they always need to be hydrated and dispersed thoroughly. So as its namesake indicates, hydrocolloid, being so that it needs to be hydrated in order for it to be activated. Okay? Now, how do you hydrate? Often it's done through dispersion of particles. So as you can see, the manner in which we use to disperse the particles are a hand blender or an immersion blender. Okay, so going back to hydration, we talked about dispersion right now of particles and hydration. Certain hydrocolloids need to be hydrated to a certain temperature in order to activate its function. Okay, so let's say, for example, perhaps you guys have heard in the recent past in your classes here of a hydrocolloid called Gelan, right, which is an algae-based hydrocolloid. Needs to always be brought up to 185 degrees Fahrenheit in order for the gelation to occur. Okay, so anything below 185 degrees, and that gel is not going to form. It's just going to be a liquid base. Similarly with methylcellulose and different forms of methylcellulose, we'll actually bring a creme brulee up to gelation by putting it in a water bath when we receive the ticket at the restaurant. So adding the water and the heat to it creates the gel, as opposed to other hydrocolloids like gelatin that actually are not thermoconductive and would break down back to a liquid form in the face of heat. Okay? Now there is yet another exception, and these are hydrocolloids that don't need any heat in order to be hydrated and activated. Okay? And examples of that are xanthan gum and carrageenan. Carrageenan I always call in the kitchen as vegetable gelatin. It works the same way as gelatin, but it is actually a seaweed product. Hydrocolloids have, the ones that have the hydration temperature, like the ones that I talked about, Gelan and methylcellulose, the amount that you put in to your liquid base to create the gel. So let's say we want to make a smoked Gouda cheese gel, okay? The ionic substance of the smoked Gouda liquid base would depend on the amount of the hydrocolloid. In this case, let's say I'm going to say Gelan. It would depend on how much Gelan I would add to that liquid base in order to achieve the function. Is that clear? So the ion content of the smoked Gouda base would determine how much Gelan I would need. Now, Gelan and all the other hydrocolloids are used in a industry standard percentage point. So we're talking about Gelan. It's usually used in 1 to 3% of the liquid base. So again, go back to the gram scale. If you have a liquid base of a smoked Gouda custard and you have 400 grams, then you would be using 1% of 400 grams of the Gelan that you're going to blend into the liquid base and bring up to the 185 temperature in order for that gel. Okay, the last point, one of the last points I'd like to touch on with hydrocolloids before we get into demos here is synergy. Okay, please keep in mind that a hydrocolloid has a characteristic of its own, a functional characteristic of its own, when it's used by itself. However, chefs can achieve even more results and even more possibility when you're talking about hydrocolloid synergy. So, for example, agar is a strong gel. But what if I wanted the brittleness of agar, but wanted the elasticity of gelatin within the same product? Well, I can adjust my ratios so that agar and gelatin are introduced into the recipes, but that are used for different functional purposes. And therefore, the ratios are adjusted based on the functional purpose. Okay? So synergy can create stronger gels and can create more and more possibilities. Here are just a short list of some of the hydrocolloids that we use in our kitchen. And before we get into the demo, I'm going to show you guys some visuals so that you can actually see how some of these hydrocolloids are actually interpreted into recipes. And then you will visually be able to see the recipes. It's kind of validating in that way. Agar, gelatin, low axle and high axle gelan, which, by the way, you know, high axle gelan creates this kind of elasticity that I'm talking about, and low axle creates that brittle nature. But gelan, the property of gelan, makes it to where you can set gels at a very high temperature and therefore serve hot custards. Iota-carrageenan and kappa-carrageenan, both vegetable gelatins, but again, iota-carrageenan forms a semi-firm gel, and kappa-carrageenan forms a harder gel, a more firm gel, and therefore are used in cohesion quite a bit. So the kappa will be used to create structure, and the iota will be used to create that creamy, milky sort of consistency within a custard. Methylcellulose we use for a lot of reasons at the restaurant. We'll get into some of those. Pectin, I know you guys have probably seen everywhere. The last grape jelly jam, Smuckers, that you opened up had grape juice, grapes, pectin, and sugar. And so pectin is always used in our preserves, in our jams. And then finally xanthan gum, which, you know, I just can't impress upon you guys enough how much I love xanthan gum. It's just, I mean, next to my wife, it's really the best. It's magic. You don't need much of it. It thickens just perfectly. It still gives you that viscosity and elasticity that you can't get out of a more conventional. Okay, so this one is a gelatin sheet with green pea. Gelatin is not thermoconductive, so when this plate is put under our heat lamp, the heat that's applied to this sheet, this green sheet up here, melts it into a uniform sauce. The gelatin keeps the sheet organized. So you know when you have a scallops dish and a chef maybe just douses some sauce on there, now you have sauce running off your plate. This was a way for me to use a hydrocolloid, gelatin, to add to a green pea puree, and then I set it on acetate paper so it was a perfect rectangle. And we literally make up this whole composition underneath and just put a gelatinized sheet of green pea on top. And the heat applied from the heat lamps on top is basically melting the sauce. And it's finished with a smoking vanilla bean for aroma. This is the filet mignon anticucho, a very Peruvian-inspired steak dish. And right here is an example of that smoked Gouda custard that we applied carrageenan to allow it to set. Okay, so this is basically a semi-soft custard that is served cold. The rigidity of the custard set with kappa carrageenan, and the milkiness of it set with iota carrageenan. And what the highlight of this dish right here is this piece of grilled cheese, which basically I've made my own block of cheese using a host of hydrocolloids. Okay, the predominant one being gelan. And what that gelan is allowing me to do is once I set my cheese, I'm able to then cut it up and actually grill the cheese, where the cheese will not fall apart on the grill like any other Italian cheese or French cheese that you'll put on your grill. It will actually solidify in the face of heat. Because as we've been talking about today, Gelan sets.
This is essentially steak and eggs. But what we've actually done here is taken egg yolk and made a béarnaise sauce out of it. A béarnaise is just another modification of the hollandaise sauce that you guys always eat on top of your eggs benedict, right? So I basically made a béarnaise, which is a hollandaise and just spiced up a little bit. And then I did a reverse spherification process on it, okay? This is where I am applying the calcium property to the liquid base. That is my béarnaise sauce. And I'm spherifying into a pool of a sodium alginate bath. The sodium alginate bath is a combination of sodium alginate and water, okay? That is going to create this liquid interior and this firm gel on the outside that encapsulates the liquid gel. So we are then able to bread the mixture and then fry it. And the result is when the guest is going to puncture that fried béarnaise, the sauce is going to ooze out, okay? So it's that effect, but it's also functional in the sense that now you can eat your eggs with that sauce. Foie gras cherry, encapsulated in cherry. So what we've done here is create a foie gras orb and dipped it in a mixture of cherry juice and Gelan, okay? And Gelan was basically able to form that uniform sauce over the orb. So I didn't want to just pour sauce over this circle of foie gras because maybe the sauce wouldn't be viscous enough, maybe it wouldn't be thick enough, and maybe it would just fall off to the side. So I added Gelan, and that allowed me to have a uniform sort of coating. You also have fluid gel set with agar-agar on the side.